What if the real war is not happening where everyone is watching, but inside your mind while you scroll through breaking news? On June 11, 2026, President Donald Trump stepped in front of the cameras and delivered a statement that instantly sent shockwaves through global markets and media networks. He claimed, "We ended the war with Iran today. They have agreed never to have a nuclear weapon. We got everything we wanted." Within minutes, Wall Street reacted like the conflict had already ended. The Dow Jones surged by 1.75%, the Nasdaq climbed by 2.54%, and investors rushed back into risk assets as headlines flashed across every major outlet. Deal reached, war over, Trump declares victory. For a brief moment, the world behaved as if a major geopolitical crisis had been resolved. But then, just under 3 hours later, something completely different happened. Iran's foreign ministry issued a short and careful statement that cut directly against the narrative being broadcast globally. They said Iran had not reached any final conclusion on an agreement, not an acceptance, but a denial of finalities itself. And in that gap between the two statements, between certainty and ambiguity, the entire story began to collapse into something far more complicated than a simple victory announcement. This is not an isolated moment. Iranian media outlets, including Tasnim News, which is closely linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have tracked these cycles. According to their public counting, this is not the first time such declarations have been made. In fact, they claim Trump has publicly signaled imminent breakthroughs or near-final deals dozens of times over the past months. Their number stands at 38 prior instances in just 2 months. This latest one would make it 39. So the obvious question appears immediately in global commentary. Is this time different, or is it just another false alarm in a repeating pattern of announcements and contradictions? But that is not the most important question. The more serious question, the one that is rarely asked in mainstream analysis, is why this pattern exists at all. Why does a U.S. president repeatedly announce progress before it is confirmed? And just as importantly, why does Iran respond in a way that allows this cycle to continue rather than shutting it down completely? Because underneath the headlines and financial reactions, something deeper is happening. This is not simply a diplomatic negotiation or a conventional military standoff. What is unfolding between the United States and Iran is a different kind of conflict entirely, one that cannot be measured only in missiles, drones, or naval positioning. Those elements are real, but they are not where the decisive battle is taking place. The real battlefield is something most traditional military frameworks are not designed to measure. There are no physical coordinates for it. No radar system can detect it. No satellite can map it, yet it is shaping decisions at the highest level of global power. That battlefield is perception. More specifically, it is the human mind operating at scale. In the next part of this analysis, we need to introduce a concept that explains this shift in modern conflict. I call it cognitive warfare. It is not about destroying infrastructure or eliminating military capacity. It is about influencing how populations interpret reality itself. It is about shaping belief, doubt, confidence, and fear at a collective level until political decisions begin to change direction on their own. To understand why this is so powerful, it helps to go back to one of the oldest thought experiments in philosophy, Plato's cave. In Plato's model, prisoners are chained inside a cave, unable to turn their heads. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, figures move, casting shadows onto a wall. The prisoners cannot see the real objects. They only see the shadows. But because they have never experienced anything else, they begin to treat those shadows as reality itself. They name them, interpret them, build beliefs around them. Their entire understanding of the world is constructed from projections. Now, the critical question Plato raises is simple but uncomfortable. Who controls the shadows? For centuries, the answer in modern politics was relatively straightforward. Governments controlled official narratives, and mainstream media acted as the distribution system for those narratives. Statements from the White House, military briefings, and major news networks created a shared version of reality for the public. Even when interpretations differed, the sources of information were relatively centralized. But that structure is changing. With the rise of social media, decentralized communication, and artificial intelligence, the ability to project shadows has expanded far beyond traditional institutions. For the first time in history, smaller actors, even those without comparable military power, can influence the perception of much larger populations directly. without needing control over traditional media channels. This is where the shift becomes strategically important. What Iran has recognized is that in modern conflict, you do not necessarily need to defeat an opponent militarily in order to influence their behavior. You can instead focus on something more fragile: the confidence of their population and the political stability of their decision-making process. The objective is not to win battles in the conventional senses. The objective is to shape the internal pressure inside the opposing system until it begins to change its own direction. If a population begins to feel that a war is too costly, too uncertain, or too endless, political pressure begins to build. That pressure moves through public opinion, then through lawmakers, and eventually reaches executive decision-making. At that point, military capacity becomes secondary to political will. And political will is far more sensitive than military capability. This is the foundation of cognitive warfare. It operates on perception rather than territory, on belief rather than force, on interpretation rather than destruction. And one of the most important tools inside this system is something relatively new in geopolitical conflict: synthetic media, including generative artificial intelligence and deepfake technology. This is where the strategy becomes more concrete. Reports linked to Iranian cyber and information units, including elements associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, suggest the use of large-scale digital content campaigns designed to circulate emotionally charged visual material. These are not traditional propaganda broadcasts. They are algorithmically distributed images and videos designed for rapid emotional impact. Some of this content includes highly dramatic visual scenarios such as nuclear explosions over urban environments, military surrender scenes, or missile strikes on infrastructure. Whether real or artificially generated is often secondary to the immediate psychological effect, because the human brain does not initially process content as true or false. It first processes it as emotionally relevant or irrelevant. Fear-based stimuli activate survival responses before analytical reasoning fully engages. That delay is critical. By the time a viewer consciously evaluates whether an image is authentic or fabricated, the emotional response has already occurred. Heart rate increases, attention narrows, memory encoding begins. Even after correction arrives, the emotional imprint does not fully disappear. And this is where cognitive warfare becomes effective at scale. It does not require belief in false information. It only requires exposure to emotionally destabilizing content often enough that it shapes background perception, not conviction. Atmosphere. A shared psychological environment begins to form where uncertainty becomes more influential than certainty, and doubt spreads faster than verification. That environment, once established, influences political discourse without direct control. It shapes what journalists emphasize, what commentators speculate about, and what audiences begin to expect. And from there, the loop begins to reinforce itself. The second layer of this strategy is less visible, but arguably more important than the use of synthetic media. It is not about what people see, but about how political systems respond to what people feel. This is where political science becomes directly connected to information warfare, and where a concept like the median voter becomes central to understanding how modern conflicts evolve inside democracies. In any democratic society, political opinion is not evenly distributed. It tends to cluster into broad groups. A significant portion of the population will already hold strong support for a policy position, while another large portion will strongly oppose it. These groups are relatively stable. Their views are deeply rooted in ideology, identity, or long-term belief systems. In practical terms, they are unlikely to shift based on new information alone. The real instability exists in the middle. This middle group, often referred to in political science as the median or swing voter segment, does not hold fixed positions on complex geopolitical issues. Their views are more fluid. They are influenced less by ideology and more by perception, timing, emotional tone, and economic context. They are also the group most exposed to daily information cycles without being fully immersed in any single narrative. This is the group that determines political direction in closely contested or high-pressure policy environments. Now, when we apply this to a conflict like the one between the United States and Iran, the strategic focus becomes clearer. The objective is not to convince the most committed supporters or the most committed opponents. Those positions are already locked in. The real influence lies in shaping the emotional and informational environment experienced by the undecided majority. If that group becomes confident in the likelihood of success, political support for continued engagement stabilizes. If that group becomes uncertain, fatigued, or doubtful, pressure begins to shift toward de-escalation. This is where perception management intersects with political pressure. Rather than attempting to change deeply held ideological beliefs, modern cognitive strategies focus on shaping emotional states: fatigue, uncertainty, skepticism, and perceived cost. These are not ideological positions. They are psychological conditions, and they are significantly more flexible. When sustained over time, these shifts do not need to be dramatic. They only need to accumulate gradually. A slight increase in perceived risk, a slight decrease in perceived clarity, a growing sense that outcomes are unpredictable or that costs are rising faster than benefits. Individually, these impressions may seem minor. Collectively, they change the direction of political momentum. This is where information campaigns, media narratives, and strategic communication converge. Different types of content begin reinforcing the same underlying emotional signal. Reports highlighting civilian casualties, economic disruption, or operational uncertainty gain more traction than technical military assessments. Not necessarily because they are more important in a factual sense, but because they are more emotionally accessible and more easily distributed across digital platforms. In parallel, economic indicators begin to play a role in shaping perception. Rising energy prices, market volatility, and revised growth forecasts do not need to be directly caused by the conflict to influence how the conflict is interpreted. They become part of the same mental model in the public imagination. Over time, this creates a convergence of signals: economic pressure, visual narratives, political commentary, and international reactions all begin pointing toward a shared emotional interpretation of the conflict. That interpretation is not necessarily uniform, but it becomes directionally consistent. The conflict begins to feel more expensive than decisive, more uncertain than controlled, and more prolonged than resolvable. Once that perception stabilizes within the median voter group, political leaders begin to adjust their messaging accordingly. This is not necessarily because they are responding directly to foreign influence, but because they are responding to domestic pressure. Approval ratings, polling data, media sentiment, and legislative feedback all begin to reflect the same underlying shift. At that point, foreign policy decisions are no longer shaped purely by military assessments or strategic objectives. They are shaped by the political cost of continuing a policy that is perceived as increasingly uncertain. This is the key transition point in cognitive warfare, when perception begins to influence policy more strongly than operational outcomes. And this is where framing theory becomes critical. Framing theory suggests that the way an event is presented can be more influential than the event itself. A single military incident can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the narrative structure surrounding it. The same operation can be framed as a defensive success, an escalation, a mistake, or a violation of international norms. The frame determines the reaction. In traditional conflict reporting, military actions tend to be presented in episodic form. Each event is reported as a separate moment in time: a strike today, a response tomorrow, a statement afterward. This structure creates a sense of continuous activity and control. It emphasizes precision, initiative, and tactical success. However, episodic framing has a structural vulnerability in the modern media environment. Because information now circulates instantly and globally, isolated incidents can be rapidly extracted from their original context and reinterpreted independently. A single operational error, even if rare, can be amplified disproportionately when visual or emotional elements are involved. For example, when reports emerge of unintended civilian harm during a strike, or when infrastructure damage is misaligned with stated objectives, those moments do not remain isolated. They circulate independently across platforms, often detached from the broader operational context. Once detached, they become symbolic, and symbolic events carry more political weight than statistical outcomes. A successful campaign, measured in operational terms, can still be politically undermined by a small number of highly visible negative incidents. This creates a structural imbalance between tactical performance and strategic perception. The result is what can be described as mistake magnification. In an environment where attention is fragmented and emotionally driven, isolated failures are more visible and more memorable than distributed successes. This does not mean military effectiveness is irrelevant. It means that military effectiveness alone is no longer sufficient to determine political sustainability in prolonged conflicts involving democratic societies and global media systems. As a result, modern states must operate in a dual environment, one of physical operations and one of continuous narrative management. And when those two environments are not perfectly aligned, tension emerges between battlefield outcomes and public interpretation. That tension is exactly what cognitive strategies are designed to exploit, not by reversing military outcomes, but by increasing the political cost of sustaining them. At this stage, it becomes necessary to examine the strongest possible counter-argument to everything discussed so far, because any serious analysis of modern conflict must account for what it gets wrong, as well as what it explains well. If we only look at perception, information flows, and cognitive pressure, we risk underestimating the continued importance of raw military and economic power. From a traditional strategic perspective, the United States still holds overwhelming advantages. Its military projection capability remains unmatched. Aircraft carriers allow rapid deployment of force across multiple regions. Precision strike systems can engage targets with extremely high accuracy. Surveillance networks integrate satellite, drone, and signals intelligence into a real-time operational picture that few states can replicate. In a purely kinetic sense, this imbalance is significant. Recent operations have demonstrated this capacity clearly. Coordinated strikes have reportedly degraded multiple categories of Iranian military infrastructure, including air defense systems, radar networks, and command and control nodes. Even without focusing on specific numbers, the broader pattern is consistent with a high level of operational superiority in conventional warfare. At the same time, maritime enforcement capabilities allow the United States and its allies to apply pressure on critical shipping routes, particularly those connected to energy exports. This introduces an additional layer of economic leverage that can influence state behavior over time. From this viewpoint, wars are ultimately decided by material endurance. Economic capacity, industrial production, logistics, and military stockpiles define the limits of how long a state can sustain conflict. In this model, information effects are secondary. They may shape sentiment, but they do not determine outcomes. Historically, there is evidence supporting this argument. Major conflicts have often been resolved through attrition, blockade, and sustained pressure on economic systems. In that sense, the idea that military and economic power remains decisive is not only plausible, but deeply grounded in historical precedent. It is also true that Iran's domestic economy faces structural constraints, long-standing sanctions, inflationary pressure, currency instability, and limitations on international trade all reduce its margin for prolonged conventional confrontation. From a purely material standpoint, this creates a disadvantage that cannot be ignored. However, this is not the full picture. The limitation of the purely military economic argument is not that it is wrong, but that it assumes political will remain stable over time. It assumes that once military superiority is established, continued application of that superiority is politically sustainable. This is where the analysis becomes more complex. If military dominance were sufficient on its own, then strategic outcomes would depend only on capability. But in practice, capability must be continuously authorized through political systems. Those systems are sensitive to public opinion, alliance cohesion, and perceived legitimacy. This is where the cognitive dimension re-enters the equation. Even if one side holds clear operational superiority, that advantage must still be translated into sustained policy. If domestic political pressure begins to shift, if public support declines, or if allied governments begin to distance themselves, the strategic environment changes regardless of battlefield outcomes. This is why statements from political leadership become significant. When a leader signals uncertainty about the stomach for prolonged engagement, it is not simply rhetorical. It reflects a constraint on strategic freedom of action. It indicates that the political system itself is becoming a limiting factor. In such conditions, military capability does not disappear, but its usability becomes conditional. That conditionality is critical because it introduces a gap between what is possible militarily and what is acceptable politically. And that gap is precisely where cognitive and informational pressures operate most effectively. This does not mean perception replaces force. It means perception shapes the boundaries within which force can be applied. The result is a layered structure of conflict. At one level, there is conventional military power, where superiority and attrition still matter greatly. At another level, there is political sustainability, where public opinion, alliance management, and narrative stability determine how long and how intensively that power can be used. When these two layers align, strategy is coherent and execution is stable. When they diverge, even strong military positions can become politically difficult to maintain over time. This divergence is what makes modern conflicts more complex than earlier eras of warfare. Information does not replace force, but it changes the environment in which force is interpreted, justified, and sustained. And this is where the argument becomes most contested. Because while some analysts emphasize the growing importance of cognitive and informational dynamics, others argue that these effects are often overstated and that in decisive moments, material power reasserts itself. Both perspectives contain truth. The real challenge is determining which layer is dominant at any given stage of a conflict, and how quickly dominance can shift when political or strategic conditions change. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the analysis. It is a reflection of the system itself. Modern conflict does not operate on a single axis of power. It operates across multiple interacting systems. Military capability, economic endurance, political legitimacy, and informational influence. Understanding how these systems interact is more important than assuming any one of them is always decisive. And that brings us back to the central tension in this situation, whether battlefield advantage automatically translates into strategic victory, or whether political and cognitive constraints ultimately define what victory is allowed to look like. At this point, the analysis needs to expand beyond a simple two-player model, because focusing only on the United States and Iran creates a blind spot that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the longer the conflict continues. There is a third actor in the system whose behavior does not fit neatly into either the military or ideological framing of the confrontation. That actor is China. On the surface, China's position appears straightforward. Official statements from Beijing emphasize de-escalation, stability, and the protection of global trade routes. Chinese state media consistently highlights the economic risks of prolonged conflict in the Middle East, particularly disruptions to energy flows and shipping lanes. From this perspective, China presents itself as a neutral power advocating for peace and predictability. However, a closer look at the structural incentives reveals a more layered reality. The first key factor is energy pricing dynamics. When conflict increases uncertainty in the Middle East, global oil prices tend to rise. For most major economies, this creates inflationary pressure and higher production costs. At first glance, this should also be negative for China, which is a major energy importer. But the structure of global sanctions changes this equation significantly. Because of Western sanctions, Russia's access to European energy markets has been severely restricted. This forces Russia to rely heavily on alternative buyers, with China becoming its most important customer. In this context, Russia's bargaining position is weakened, and China gains leverage in price negotiations. As global energy volatility increases, Russia becomes more dependent on stable long-term contracts with China. This allows Beijing to secure energy imports at more favorable rates than would be possible in a balanced market environment. In other words, global instability in one region indirectly creates cost advantages for China in another. The second layer involves long-term dependency structures. China now accounts for a substantial portion of Russia's external trade, particularly in manufactured goods, industrial components, and dual-use technologies. This creates a relationship that is not purely transactional, but increasingly asymmetrical. Russia, facing limited access to Western markets, gradually shifts into a position where it depends on Chinese supply chains for both civilian and strategic needs. Over time, this shifts the balance from partnership to dependency, even if both sides publicly maintain language of cooperation and strategic alignment. At the same time, China uses this dependency carefully. It does not rush the relationship or overtly dominate it. Instead, it applies gradual economic pressure through pricing, delayed infrastructure agreements, and selective investment timing. This allows Beijing to extract concessions while maintaining the appearance of partnership. The result is a slow structural realignment in which Russia becomes increasingly constrained in its strategic autonomy without a direct military confrontation. The third element is diplomatic positioning. China has consistently avoided taking explicit responsibility for escalation in the Middle East while also refraining from joining Western-led sanctions regimes. It votes in international forums in ways that protect certain partners from maximal pressure, while simultaneously issuing statements that emphasize restraint and negotiation. This dual positioning serves multiple functions at once. It reduces the risk of secondary sanctions, preserves access to global markets, and maintains relationships with multiple sides of the conflict simultaneously. In effect, China is operating in a space that is neither fully aligned nor fully opposed to any single actor. It is maintaining optionality. This concept of optionality is strategically significant. While other actors are locked into higher cost positions, China preserves the ability to adjust its stance as conditions evolve. It can increase pressure, reduce visibility, or reposition itself diplomatically depending on how the conflict develops. In parallel, China benefits from the broader instability in more subtle ways. As Western attention and resources are partially diverted toward managing geopolitical crises, China continues to expand its economic and technological capabilities in less contested strategic domains. This includes manufacturing dominance, supply chain consolidation, and infrastructure investment across multiple regions. In this sense, China is not necessarily driving the conflict, but it is structurally positioned to extract advantages from its continuation. The key point is not that China is secretly controlling events, but that it is operating in a system where it is less exposed to the direct costs of escalation while still benefiting from some of its secondary effects. This creates a strategic asymmetry. The actors most visibly engaged in the conflict bear the highest immediate political and economic costs. The actor least visibly engaged retains flexibility and accumulates indirect advantages over time. Understanding this dynamic is essential for interpreting the broader geopolitical environment, because it reframes the conflict from a simple bilateral confrontation into a multi-layered system of incentives, constraints, and indirect gains. At this stage, the analysis also returns to a central theme that runs through all three actors: perception versus structure. The United States operates with significant structural military and economic power, but must continuously justify its use through domestic and allied political systems. Iran operates with limited conventional capacity, but focuses heavily on shaping perception and political pressure to offset material disadvantages. China operates with high structural economic leverage and relatively low exposure to direct conflict costs, allowing it to benefit from instability without being directly drawn into it. Each actor is therefore optimizing within different constraints. And this is why the conflict cannot be understood through a single lens. Military outcomes, economic flows, political stability, and informational influence are all interacting simultaneously, often pulling in different directions. The result is a system where no single domain is fully dominant at all times, but where shifts in one domain can cascade into others unexpectedly. This is what makes the situation fundamentally unstable in analytical terms, even when it appears controlled on the surface.